Over the last couple of years in the realm of podcasting gear, it's all been Rode this and Mackie that, and for good reason. Rode has been setting the bar since the OG Rodecaster Pro came out. But as I was doing up the video on the best podcast setup for 2024, stay tuned for that by the way, it is coming up, get subscribed so you don't miss that. The Podtrak P4 came up as probably the best bang for your buck for a multi-person podcast, and that can't be right, can it? I mean, surely someone somewhere has released something at some point to put this thing to bed. I mean, it has been 4 years. Well, and nobody has. And I don't know if anyone realizes how long ago 2020 was in tech. Things have come a long way since then. At the time, it was a massive rush to supply the podcasting industry, and the Rodecaster Pro was sitting on top of the pile for podcasting gear. And when I say on top of the pile, it wasn't even close. The Zoom L8 had come out, but was mostly ignored by podcasters because it was way too much of a learning curve, and it had some quirks that meant it kind of fell out of favor. The Tascam Mixcast 4 was still a year away, and the Podtrak P4 and P8 came out later in the year in 2020. It was bleak for everybody but Rode. They had been unchallenged in their supremacy for around 2-ish years, and while some announcements were kind of attractive, they all seemed to fall kind of short. And while most people were really looking forward to seeing what the Podtrak P8 was going to bring to the party, this P4 was kind of an afterthought for a lot of people. Now, don't get me wrong, people bought into this unit because it was cheap and it was popular, but all the buzz was saved for the Rodecaster Pro and all its possible challengers. But what is fascinating, when you look back at all that, the only 2 units that are still standing, and still being discussed for that matter, are the Rodecaster series. Of course, they've moved on to the second. And this, the Podtrak P4. Now, the Rodecaster series is understandable. As I mentioned, it has moved on to the upgraded second in the series, as well as the whole fill-out of the series. But this P4, it stayed the same. How is that possible? Is this really that good? And what is it about this thing that makes it so good? Well, that isn't as easy to answer as you might think. You see, this Podtrak P4 isn't the best at, well, anything. The build quality is Zoom, and well, that's the best way to put it. More precisely, it's Zoom plastic. While I don't normally hold that against Zoom, this is more of a comparative look at the unit, and well, Zoom plastic doesn't stack well in comparisons. I mean, you can even hear it. What's worse about this is it isn't even the most spec'd out unit up for offer either. Sure, it does multi-track through the SD card, but it's only 2 channels as an interface with your computer, just left and right. Probably the most damning spec on it is that it's 16-bit and 44:1 for resolution. And I gotta tell you, that was rough in 2020, and it hasn't really gotten much better 4 years on. The world really has moved on to at least 24-bit and 48 kilohertz. What's really fascinating though, is the preamps on this are the same as the Zoom H8, which have an EIN of neg 124. Now, that isn't stellar or gonna win any awards by any means, but they still outclass the brand new H Essentials series. That's embarrassing. How does that even happen, Zoom? Now, moving on, the Bluetooth is optional as long as you buy the dongle, which is a bit of a trigger for me, I'm not gonna lie. But again, 2020 was a different time and it wasn't the biggest issue back then, so I can let it slide here. Now then, after all that, I'm sure you're questioning my sanity when I say that this is still one of the best podcast interfaces on the market. How do I explain that? Well, we have to switch gears here. Now, I usually praise Rode for being the one to usher in the new generation of audio gear that breaks down the barriers between beginner and pro. Things like self-noise, DSP, all the things. But I should mention that Zoom was on top of that with the 70 dB of gain that was on the Podtrak P4 and P8. And 2020, that was unheard of on anything consumer, even prosumer, and it definitely wasn't on anything with the podcast name on it. These specs were saved for gear like Arturia or Universal Audio. Even the original Rodecaster Pro only had 55 dB of gain. 70 dB was life-changing for some. Sure, it wasn't the cleanest gain, but you could actually comfortably use an SM7B on your podcast. This is the SM7B going through the Podtrak P4. It's on channel 2. I know you probably can't see it because the screen is tiny, but you're going to have to take my word at it. We're sitting at 6 on the gain dial, and we're getting some pretty decent readings around neg 9 to neg 12 on this thing, which is actually pretty impressive. Let's see exactly what it sounds like as you go up. Okay. It's going to turn into ASMR. Why do I end up doing a lot of ASMR with Zoom products? Okay, by the way, we're going to get loud in 5, 4, 3, 2, take it away. But that's not all. Hey, it has 4 inputs. Also, it has a line in for phone calls with mix minus. Also, Bluetooth for phone calls with mix minus. Hey, we got sound pads. It has DSP, or at least some of it. Separate headphone outputs. And if you squint and look real close, you can see the screen they have on it. Yeah, it's right there. Sorry, I had to. But then, you're probably thinking, well, all that's great, but you're basically just describing what is the status quo right now, perhaps with inferior specs. But nothing I just mentioned was the reason that this thing is goated in 2024. Because there's one spec or feature that this thing had that not a single manufacturer could compete with, and perhaps why no manufacturer has been able to dethrone it. And that is the accessibility of it. This thing hit the market at $200 US, which was stupid cheap, even when you consider inflation. And yes, it's only been 4 years, but considering all the things that COVID did, that's like $240 by today's standards. But even more impressively, this thing currently sells for $150 US. And it's funny because I don't know if Zoom knew what they had when they released this way back. The big buildup was happening for the Podtrak P8, as I mentioned. That was supposed to be the road killer. But price to performance, since it shared several of those specs that this thing had, including that resolution, that P8 was a hard sell at that price. But on the other hand, this thing hit the market hard, and it was embraced big time by a lot of people, and it was revered as the poor man's Rodecaster Pro, though I doubt Zoom called it that. This thing had legs. And honestly, it still does, which gives this thing a bit more of an honor than most people are willing to admit these days. This, the Podtrak P4, is one of the best price-to-performance podcast mixers of all time. However, that begs a question. What the hell, Zoom? Why is there no V2 on this thing? Think about the absolute ownership you would have over this section of the podcast community. And really, all it would take are slightly better preamps and perhaps some baked-in Bluetooth. I mean, you could even keep your precious plastic. Even that screen won't matter. I guess a boy can dream. So if you're planning a podcast that requires 2 or more channels, and you're trying to keep things cheap right now in 2024, this is still the go-to recommendation. And perhaps, if Zoom won't upgrade it, maybe another company wants to take a shot at it. It's an open invitation. We shall see. Again, stay tuned for that best podcast setups for 2024. It's coming just around the corner. Cheers, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.